West Virginia has always been a place where the impossible feels just a little too possible. These ancient mountains hold secrets in their shadows, and the small town of Grafton learned this the hard way in the summer of 1964. But to understand why what happened there shook the community so deeply, you need to know what Grafton had already endured. This wasn't some idyllic American town living its best life. By 1964, Grafton was dying. Walking down Main Street meant passing boarded-up shops and abandoned factories, their broken windows staring out like empty eye sockets. The few people you'd encounter moved with the heavy gait of those who'd watched their world crumble and had no power to stop it. It hadn't always been this way. Grafton once mattered. Back in the 1840s, when developers carved a vital road through the hostile Appalachian wilderness, they chose a steep hillside overlooking the Tygart River as the site for a new settlement. It was a gamble. The terrain was brutal, winters could kill, and isolation was absolute. But the location had one crucial advantage. When the railroad came through a decade later, Grafton became the intersection point where rail, road, and river met. You couldn't move goods or people through this part of America without passing through Grafton. The town exploded overnight. Population surged. Factories appeared along the riverbanks, their smokestacks belching prosperity into the mountain air. Money flowed. Families who'd scraped by for years suddenly thrived. Children who might have expected lives of hard labor could dream bigger. For a brief, shining moment, Grafton was everything a small American town aspired to be. Then came the Civil War, and Grafton's strategic importance became a curse. The town controlled transportation routes both sides desperately needed. Battles raged through streets where children had played. Buildings became barracks. Blood soaked into the ground. For years, Grafton lived under the shadow of violence, never knowing when the next clash would erupt. Brother fought brother. Neighbor turned against neighbor. The dead filled hastily dug graves on the outskirts of town. When the war finally ended, Grafton could have withered away. Instead, it rebuilt. Those same strategic advantages that made it valuable during the war made it valuable in peace. The post-war decades brought unprecedented growth. New factories, bigger and more advanced. Workers from across the country and overseas, all chasing steady wages. For nearly a century, Grafton thrived. Generations built lives there. The sound of factory whistles marked the rhythm of daily existence. This was American resilience made manifest. But nothing lasts forever. The 1950s brought a different kind of destruction. Financial pressures and environmental concerns converged to strangle Grafton's industrial base. One by one, the factories closed. Companies pulled out, taking jobs and hope with them. Workers who'd expected to retire from the same companies their fathers had worked for found themselves unemployed with nowhere to turn. The young fled to cities. Those who remained watched their community decay. By 1964, Grafton was a ghost of itself. The population had collapsed. Abandoned factory buildings stood like rusting monuments to better days. Main Street was a corridor of failure. Shop after shop closed and gathering dust. The people who remained moved through life with a kind of numb resignation. They'd survived the Civil War, built an industrial powerhouse, and now watched it all crumble. The mood was dark, made worse by the constant Cold War threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over America like a guillotine blade. This was Grafton when summer arrived in 1964. A town that had endured too much, absorbed too many blows, seen too many dreams die. The residents were exhausted, struggling to maintain normalcy in a place that felt increasingly like it had no future. They went to work, came home, tried to find small pleasures in lives that seemed to be slowly contracting. Nobody was looking for monsters. Nobody was expecting the impossible. They just wanted to survive another day, another week, another year. They wanted their lives back, wanted the prosperity and stability they'd lost. The last thing anyone in Grafton needed was something that would make them question the very nature of reality itself. But on warm June nights in Appalachia, when darkness settles over the mountains and the trees press close to lonely roads, what we need and what we get are often very different things. The people of Grafton were about to discover that their town's troubles weren't over. In fact, they were about to face something that would make economic collapse and historical trauma seem almost mundane by comparison. Robert Cochrell had no idea what was waiting for him on Riverside Drive that night. He was just a young reporter for the local newspaper, the Grafton Sentinel, heading home after working late. 26 years old, ambitious, eager to make a name for himself in journalism. He'd spent the evening in the paper's offices, probably writing about city council meetings or local sports, the kind of small-town news that kept communities connected. Now he just wanted to get home, maybe grab something to eat, and collapse into bed. The road ahead curved through a stretch of woods just outside town. Riverside Drive followed the Tygart River, winding through a landscape that was beautiful by day, but unsettling after dark. The trees grew thick here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The river moved beside the road, a constant whisper in the darkness. Cochrell had driven this route hundreds of times. He knew every bend, every pothole. It was just past 11 when his headlights caught something in the road ahead. Cochrell's foot moved toward the brake, his mind processing what his eyes were seeing but couldn't quite accept. There, standing in the middle of the carriageway, completely blocking his path, was something massive, something that shouldn't exist. At first glance, Cochrell thought it might be a bear. The size was right, the bulk and mass of the thing. Black bears were common enough in these mountains. But then the headlights hit it fully, and Cochrell's rational explanation evaporated like morning mist. The creature was white, not the brown or black of a bear, but a pale, ghostly white that seemed to glow in the headlight beams. And it wasn't fur. The surface of the thing was smooth, almost slick, glistening like it was wet or covered in oil. It reminded Cochrell of a seal's pelt, that strange, slick shine, but on something that stood upright and massive. Cochrell's car came to a complete stop, engine idling, headlights illuminating this impossible sight. The creature stood there, seemingly unaware of the vehicle or its driver. It wasn't looking at Cochrell because, and this is where the young reporter's mind truly began to reject what his eyes were showing him, it had no head. Where there should have been a skull, a face, eyes, a mouth, there was nothing. Just a thick, rectangular torso that rose up into massively powerful shoulders and arms. The body seemed to end in a flat, abbreviated way, as if someone had sculpted a powerful humanoid form and simply forgotten to add the head. But this wasn't some statue or prop. The thing was moving. It walked on two short, stocky legs that seemed almost comically inadequate for the massive upper body they supported. But despite their appearance, those legs carried the creature with a deliberate, ponderous gait. It was crossing the road, moving from one side to the other with the slow inevitability of a landslide. As Cochrell sat frozen behind the wheel, the creature emitted a sound that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. A high-pitched, shrill whistling noise that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The thing had no visible mouth, no orifice that might produce sound, yet the whistling was unmistakable. It pierced the night air, rising and falling in pitch, almost musical but deeply unsettling. The young reporter tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His journalist's brain, trained to observe and analyze, struggled to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was someone in a costume. But who would be out here at this hour in such an elaborate getup? And the way it moved, the sheer size and mass of it, seemed beyond what any human in a suit could achieve. Maybe it was some kind of animal he'd never encountered. But what animal looked like this? What creature of nature was headless and white and glistening and walked upright? The creature took another step, its massive body swaying with that same ponderous rhythm. Cochrell's hands strangled the steering wheel. Every muscle in his body screamed to reverse, to flee, but he sat paralyzed, caught between primal terror and something deeper, a journalist's desperate need to witness and understand. The headless thing seemed utterly unaware of the car, no acknowledgement of the headlights bathing its pale flesh in harsh white light. No reaction to the idling engine just yards away. It simply moved, crossing the road with the slow inevitability of a glacier, as if Cochrell and his vehicle existed in a different reality entirely. The young reporter's mind scrambled for explanations. A costume? Who would be out here after 11 at night in something so elaborate? And the size of it, the sheer physical mass. No human could move like that, couldn't replicate that bulk and weight. An animal then. But what animal was white and slick and headless and bipedal? What creature of nature whistled from no visible mouth? The being reached the far side of Riverside Drive. Long grass bent and crushed audibly under its weight. Then it pushed into the tree line, branches parting around that massive frame. The whistling faded to nothing. The crashing through underbrush grew distant. Then, silence. The thing was gone, swallowed by the Appalachian darkness as completely as if it had never existed. Cochrell sat frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. His heart slammed against his ribs hard enough to hurt. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool night air. His breath came in ragged gasps that fogged the windshield. His eyes refused to leave the tree line, expecting at any moment to see that pale form come charging back out of the shadows. But nothing moved. The forest had gone quiet, that strange silence that follows something unnatural. Even the normal night sounds, crickets and rustling leaves and distant bird calls, had ceased. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Reality crashed back. Cochrell's journalist training kicked in through the haze of adrenaline. If this was real, and God help him it felt real, then he needed corroboration, other witnesses, evidence, something to prove he hadn't just experienced a breakdown brought on by exhaustion and the soul-crushing depression of watching Grafton die. He wrenched the car into a tight turn, tires squealing, and gunned it back toward downtown. The Sentinel's offices appeared in his headlights, mostly dark but with a few windows still lit. Jerry Morse and Jim Mouser were there, finishing their own work. Experienced reporters, both of them. Practical men. Skeptics. Perfect. Cochrell burst through the office door looking he knew like a lunatic. Wild-eyed, disheveled, breathing hard. Morse and Mouser looked up from their desks, alarm crossing their faces. The story spilled out in a breathless rush. Massive creature, white, glistening like a seal's skin. No head, just thick shoulders and powerful arms. Short, stocky legs. Crossing Riverside Drive, making this whistling sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Just standing there, oblivious before disappearing into the trees. The reaction was exactly what Cochrell expected, but dreaded. Morse and Mouser exchanged that look. The look that said their young colleague had finally cracked under the pressure of long hours and a dying town and too much coffee. Gentle suggestions followed. He'd been working too hard. Maybe saw a bear and his tired brain filled in the rest. Should probably head home, get some sleep. But Cochrell wouldn't let it go. His desperation was raw, genuine. This wasn't the tone of someone spinning a story or playing a prank. This was bone-deep fear, mixed with the manic need to prove he wasn't losing his mind. Finally, more out of concern than belief, Morse and Mouser agreed to humor him. They'd drive out there, take a look, hopefully find some mundane explanation. The three men piled into Cochrell's car. The drive back to Riverside Drive took them through Grafton's corpse, empty streets, dark windows, abandoned factories looming like tombstones. The town felt even more dead at this hour, if that was possible. As they approached the encounter site, something shifted in the car's atmosphere. Maybe the isolation of this stretch of road. Maybe the way the trees pressed close on both sides, blocking out the stars. Maybe just Cochrell's fear infecting his companions. But Morse and Mouser stopped treating this like a joke. Cochrell slowed at the spot and pointed. There. That's where it stood. There's where it went into the trees. They climbed out, leaving headlights on. The night wrapped around them immediately. The forest breathed with sound, leaves rustling, something moving in the underbrush, the Tigart River's constant whisper. And there, illuminated in the headlight beams, was proof. The roadside grass lay flattened and crushed. Something massive had pushed through here, leaving a clear trail of broken vegetation leading into the woods. The width of it suggested incredible bulk. The pattern indicated 2 legs, not 4. Morse crouched down, examining the trail with his flashlight. This wasn't deer damage, wasn't even bear. Whatever made this was huge and walked upright. He looked at Mouser. Mouser looked back. Their skepticism was cracking. The 3 reporters stood at the tree line, peering into the darkness. The trail disappeared between the trunks. Someone would have to follow it. Someone would have to walk into those woods at night, pursuing something impossible. Journalistic pride won out over common sense. This could be huge. Unknown creature in West Virginia. Documentation could make their careers, put the Grafton Sentinel on the national map. They moved forward. 50 yards in, the forest closed around them. Their flashlight beams cut weak tunnels through the darkness. Every sound amplified. Every shadow became threat. The smell hit Cochrell then, something he hadn't noticed during the initial encounter. Wet and organic, like river water mixed with something else. Something wrong. The whistling started without warning. All 3 men froze. That same high-pitched sound Cochrell had described, coming from somewhere ahead, closer than felt safe. The tone rose and fell, almost musical but deeply alien. No human throat could make that sound. No animal Morse or Mouser had ever encountered. Then came the snapping. Not twigs. Substantial branches, the kind that require real force to break. Something massive was moving through the forest. The sounds grew louder, closer. They ran. No discussion, no debate. Pure instinct. They crashed back through the woods, branches whipping faces, roots grabbing at feet. Behind them, the whistling continued. The breaking branches, the sense of something enormous pushing through vegetation that bent and snapped under its weight. They hit the road and dove into the car. Cochrell's hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine caught. He floored it. None of them looked back. The drive to the office happened in stunned silence. When they pulled up, they sat without moving, trying to process what had just occurred. 3 professional journalists had fled in terror from something they couldn't name. Morse broke the silence. Whatever that was, it was real. They'd all heard it, all felt it. That wasn't imagination or suggestion. Something unknown was in those woods. The question was what to do about it. The debate lasted until dawn started painting the eastern sky. Finally, decision made. Cochrell would write it. Everything he'd seen, everything they'd experienced. Factual, detailed, honest. Let people make of it what they would. By the time they walked into the office as the morning shift arrived, the story was already forming in Cochrell's mind. He'd missed the deadline for today's paper, but tomorrow's edition would carry something Grafton hadn't seen in years. Real news. Something that mattered. Something impossible. He spent the day writing, revising, making sure every detail was exact. His editor read it twice, looked at Cochrell like he'd grown a second head, then looked at Morse and Mauser for confirmation. They nodded. Every word was true, as far as they could verify. The article went to print. The next morning, the citizens of Grafton woke up to a headline that would change their town forever. A towering, headless monster had been seen on Riverside Drive, and the reporter who saw it was willing to stake his reputation on the claim. Robert Cochrell braced for ridicule. He expected to become a laughingstock, the young reporter who'd cracked under pressure and started seeing things. What he got instead was something he never anticipated. The phones at the Sentinel started ringing before 9 a.m., and they didn't stop. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By mid-morning, the Sentinel's small office was under siege. Phone lines jammed with callers, people appearing at the door demanding to speak with Cochrell. The story had spread through Grafton like wildfire, and instead of mockery, the young reporter found himself drowning in validation, because he wasn't the only one who'd seen it. A woman who lived near Riverside Drive called first, voice shaking. 3 nights before Cochrell's encounter, she'd seen something white and massive moving through her backyard after midnight. Tall, impossibly broad, no discernible head. She'd convinced herself it was moonlight and shadow, until she read Cochrell's article. Then came a night shift worker who'd seen something huge and pale cross Route 119 ahead of his truck at 2 a.m. He'd slammed his brakes, heart hammering, but the thing vanished. He'd told himself it was a deer, even knowing damn well it wasn't. More calls followed. A teenager sneaking home late, an elderly fisherman at dawn, a passing truck driver. Each story different in detail but eerily consistent. Something large, something pale, something bipedal with no visible head, something impossible. Within days, the story jumped to regional newspapers, then national outlets. Suddenly, reporters from Charleston, Pittsburgh, New York were calling, wanting interviews. Grafton, which had spent years fading into irrelevance, was famous again. But this time, fame brought chaos. They arrived like an invasion, men with rifles and bold proclamations about bagging the monster, teenagers seeking thrills, amateur cryptozoologists with cameras, drunk locals desperate for excitement in a town offering none. The woods around Riverside Drive became a dangerous circus. Armed groups tramped through the forest at all hours, shooting at shadows and occasionally each other. Kids camped out hoping for glimpses. The noise drove away normal wildlife, which only convinced the hunters something unnatural lurked there. Grafton police, already stretched thin, suddenly dealt with trespassing complaints, noise violations, public intoxication, and 2 separate incidents of hunters accidentally shooting each other. The mayor held a press conference requesting armed parties cease their activities. The creature, if it existed, had never harmed anyone. The real danger was overeager hunters turning the woods into a war zone. His words fell on deaf ears. If anything, official pushback increased interest. City authorities began damage control, suggesting Cochrell had seen someone moving furniture, a practical joker in costume, maybe a mangy bear. The stress of working at a struggling newspaper might have affected his perception, but it was too late. The story had taken on its own life, and the sightings kept coming. The most compelling arrived that August. Thomas and Edward Burke, father and son, were felling trees on land Thomas had recently purchased, about 5 miles from Cochrell's encounter site. Legitimate work, hard labor in summer heat. They'd brought 2 blue-tick hounds that normally lounged in shade while the men worked. Around 4 p.m., both dogs went berserk, barking frantically, hackles raised, staring into deeper woods. Thomas and Edward killed their chainsaws, suddenly aware of something approaching, large, pushing through undergrowth with enough force to snap branches audibly. Thomas thought bear immediately. He and Edward grabbed shotguns from their truck, weapons loaded and ready. The dogs continued barking but wouldn't advance, staying close to the men despite being trained hunting dogs bred for fearlessness. That alone was wrong. The underbrush parted. What emerged was no bear. 7 feet tall, maybe 8. Massively built through shoulders and torso, thick with muscle under skin deathly pale and glistening wet. 2 legs, short and stocky but powerful, and no head. Where a skull should sit atop those shoulders, there was nothing. Just thick neck and sinew ending in a flat, abbreviated way. Thomas raised his shotgun, finger on trigger, safety off. Edward did the same. Both aimed at center mass. 30 yards. Couldn't miss. They didn't fire. The creature stopped, standing as if surveying the clearing, the felled trees, the equipment, the truck. Taking in the scene despite having no eyes, the dogs barked themselves hoarse. The thing showed no reaction, no flinch, no acknowledgement. It simply stood there, that massive chest rising and falling with breath. Then it walked forward, not charging, not threatening, just that same ponderous, deliberate gait Cochrell had described. 50 yards became 40. 40 became 30. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but the creature wasn't attacking, wasn't even acknowledging them. It walked like they didn't exist. At 20 yards, it angled slightly, passing the clearing along some path they couldn't comprehend. Close enough they could smell it now. River water and decay. Wet, organic wrongness. The dogs went silent, cowering behind the men's legs. The creature walked past and into the trees on the far side. Branches bent around its bulk. The crashing of its passage faded. Then, silence. Thomas and Edward stood frozen, shotguns still raised, for a full minute after it disappeared. Finally, Edward lowered his weapon, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Thomas tried to speak, but no words came. They packed their equipment without discussion and left. Neither would return to that property for 3 months. When they finally reported their encounter to the Sentinel, Morse interviewed them personally. He knew Thomas Burke. Solid man. Honest. Not given to flights of fancy. If Thomas said he'd seen something, he'd seen something. The article ran with their full names and detailed account. The story should have reignited the monster mania. Instead, something shifted. Maybe people were getting used to the idea of something strange in the woods. Maybe the consistent descriptions from credible witnesses made it feel more real and therefore more frightening. The amateur hunting parties dwindled. The thrill seekers moved on to other diversions. But the sightings continued sporadically. A construction worker, a couple driving home late. Always the same description. Always that pale, headless form moving with purpose through the night. Then came the incident that proved the creature wasn't confined to land. Mid-1980s, nearly 2 decades after Cochrell's encounter, Grafton had continued its slow decline, the monster largely forgotten except as local folklore. A man decided to do some night fishing on the Tigard River, taking out a small boat to find spots where other fishermen wouldn't compete. For an hour, he had good luck, netting several sturgeon, pleased with his decision to fish when nobody else was around. Then something bumped the hull, hard, solid. He leaned over to look, seeing nothing in the dark water. The river behind him exploded upward. A large, deathly pale figure thrashed in the water, massive fists hammering in what seemed like distress or rage. It was in the river. The thing could swim, or at least move through water. Its huge fists swung wildly until they contacted the boat's side. It began pushing down. The hull disappeared beneath the surface with shocking speed. The fisherman went into the water, thrashing and screaming for help. Lights switched on in the nearby campsite. The pale creature continued grabbing around itself as if searching for him. But like the Burkes had witnessed, it seemed unaware of audible stimuli. It didn't react to his screams. Then it moved off, disappearing beneath the flowing water, seemingly satisfied with sinking the boat. The fisherman was pulled to shore by campers who saw no sign of his attacker, only loose items floating away on the current. Police responded, took statements, found no evidence except the fisherman's genuine terror and his missing boat. The story made local news briefly, then faded. The Grafton Monster, as it had come to be called, remained unexplained. Some sightings legitimate, others probably misidentification or hoax. But enough credible encounters existed to suggest something genuinely unknown lurked in the West Virginia wilderness. Something that defied easy categorization. Something that seemed as comfortable in water as on land. Something that appeared to lack normal sensory organs yet moved with clear purpose. The question wasn't whether people had seen something. Too many witnesses, too consistent descriptions. The question was what they'd seen, and that answer remained frustratingly out of reach. The Grafton Monster occupies a strange place in American cryptid lore, not because of how many people saw it, though there were plenty of witnesses, not because those witnesses were credible, though many absolutely were, but because of what they described. That headless, pale form sets the Grafton Monster apart from virtually every other creature reported across the United States. America drowns in monster stories. Bigfoot sightings number in the thousands. Dogmen have their own substantial folklore. Lizard people, Mothman, Jersey Devil. The list sprawls endlessly. But all these entities, however bizarre, share fundamental characteristics. They have heads, eyes, mouths. They fit however loosely into categories biology recognizes. Predator, primate, reptile, something. The Grafton Monster fits nowhere. A massive bipedal creature with no discernible head. No visible eyes, yet it navigates terrain perfectly. No apparent ears, yet it moves with purpose. No mouth, yet witnesses heard it whistle. It breaks every rule. Over the decades, theories have emerged trying to explain what Cochrell and the others actually witnessed. Some rational, some bizarre, none entirely satisfying. The simplest explanation, misidentification. Black bears are common in West Virginia. A bear standing upright could approximate the size and general shape. But every witness described pale or white coloring, not black or brown. The texture was wrong too, consistently described as slick and glistening, not furred. And bears have very obvious heads with distinctive profiles. Even in poor light, even from a distance, a bear looks like a bear. What about a diseased bear? Mange causes hair loss and can make animals appear ghostly pale. Severe cases might explain unusual coloring and behavior. But mange doesn't erase a head. Even a badly diseased bear still has a clearly visible skull and snout, and the size exceeds even large males, which max out around 6 feet upright. The Grafton Monster stood 7 to 8 feet consistently. Perhaps the witnesses themselves are the answer. Grafton in 1964 was a traumatized community. Economic collapse, widespread unemployment, the psychological weight of watching your world die. Layer on Cold War anxiety, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and you have people primed for breaks from reality. Maybe Cochrell, exhausted from long hours, hallucinated. His stressed brain constructed a monster from ordinary stimuli. Someone pushing a loaded cart, the load obscuring their head and upper body. Tree shadows in headlights, fatigue and fear filling in the rest. Once he published his account, other people had a template. Their own ambiguous experiences got unconsciously shaped to match his description. Suggestion is powerful. People genuinely believe they saw what others reported because the brain fills gaps memory can't resolve. But this theory crashes against the Burke encounter. Father and son, both witnessing simultaneously in broad daylight at 4 p.m., their dogs reacting with primal terror. Multiple witnesses in good lighting, seeing the same impossible thing makes hallucination far less likely. And hallucinations don't leave physical evidence. The trampled vegetation, the broken branches, the trail through crushed grass. Stress doesn't bend foliage in consistent patterns, suggesting something massive and bipedal. A more exotic theory proposes an unknown species, something that evolved in isolation, perhaps in the deep cave systems, honeycombing the Appalachians. A creature with no natural predators, explaining its lack of fear or even awareness of humans. Living in total darkness would explain absent eyes. Semi-aquatic lifestyle, suggested by the river encounter, explains the seal-like skin. But the missing head. The theory gets creative here. Maybe it has a head so small relative to the massive body that it appears absent, especially in poor light. Or perhaps the head retracts into the shoulders when threatened, a defensive posture creating the headless silhouette. Sea turtles withdraw heads into shells. Maybe this creature evolved something similar. The whistling could come from specialized organs in the chest cavity rather than a mouth. Whales produce complex vocalizations without traditional vocal cords. Perhaps this creature developed similar capabilities, creating sound through resonating chambers in its torso. It's elaborate, requiring multiple unprecedented evolutionary adaptations. Possible in abstract? Perhaps. Likely. Much harder to argue. And it still doesn't explain why no bodies have ever been found. No bones, no physical proof beyond crushed vegetation and terrified witnesses. Environmental contamination offers another angle. West Virginia's industrial past left toxic scars. Chemical runoff, heavy metal pollution, illegal dumping. What if the monster was once a normal animal that suffered catastrophic mutations from environmental toxins, radiation or chemicals causing severe developmental abnormalities? This explains a singular creature rather than a breeding population. It explains seemingly impossible biology. Mutations create truly bizarre results. But it doesn't explain sightings spanning decades, unless multiple animals suffered identical mutations, which strains all credibility. The theories grow stranger. Some paranormal researchers suggest the creature isn't biological at all. Instead, it's interdimensional, something that occasionally crosses into our reality from elsewhere. This explains the lack of normal sensory organs. It perceives our world through means we can't comprehend. Electromagnetic fields, dimensional vibrations, not sight or sound. The fact it seems unaware of humans, walking past armed men and barking dogs without reaction, supports this. Perhaps it exists slightly out of phase with our reality. We perceive it, but it can't perceive us. Moving through a version of the forest that overlaps ours but isn't quite the same. Unprovable? Absolutely. But no more unprovable than suggesting an unknown species of massive headless mammals lives in West Virginia caves. Then there's the golem hypothesis. Truly bizarre, but it addresses the headless nature more directly than any other theory. In Jewish mystical tradition, a golem is artificial life created from clay or mud, animated through religious ritual and prayer. It has no consciousness, no soul, just a magical construct following its creator's commands. Importantly, a golem needs neither food nor rest. It simply exists, potentially wandering long after its creator has died. Could the Grafton Monster be a golem? Perhaps during early settlement or even before. Someone with mystical knowledge created such a being. For protection? Labor? Unknown. The creator died or left, but the golem remained, wandering mountains and forests without purpose or direction. This explains no head. A golem doesn't need sensory organs because it doesn't perceive as living creatures do. It might navigate by mystical means, drawn by earth energies. The whistling is air passing through clay-like substance, not biological vocalization. Its unawareness of humans makes sense because it's not truly aware of anything. It simply moves, exists, endures. The pale, glistening appearance could be wet clay. Comfort in water makes sense for something made from earth and moisture. Massive size and strength pose no limitation for something not bound by biological constraints. It requires accepting magic as real. For many, that's impossible, but it explains the evidence more completely than most biological theories. And it has haunting poetry. Grafton, a town that survived war only to be killed by economics, haunted by a mindless being that endures without purpose. Creature and community both outliving their reason for existence. The sightings have diminished over the years. The initial wave in the 1960s was intense, perhaps amplified by Cold War anxiety and the human need for distraction from nuclear dread. As decades passed, reports grew sporadic. The last credible sighting was over 20 years ago. Maybe the creature died, if it was ever alive. Maybe it moved deeper into wilderness as human encroachment increased. Maybe it returned to wherever it came from. Grafton itself continues its slow fade. The population has stabilized at a fraction of its peak. Some of the abandoned factories have been demolished. Others still stand, rusting monuments to industrial glory that will never return. The people who remain are resilient, finding ways to survive in a town that has seen far better days. The Grafton Monster has become local folklore now. T-shirts in gift shops, a statue downtown that tourists occasionally photograph. Town festivals use it as a mascot. The terror has been sanitized into kitsch, the way communities often handle trauma they can't fully process. But talk to the old-timers, the ones who were there in 1964, and you'll see something else. A look in their eyes when the subject comes up. Robert Cochrell died years ago, but before he passed, he never wavered from his account. Never claimed it was misidentification or hallucination. He saw what he saw. Jerry Morse and Jim Mauser, both gone now too, supported his story until the end. Thomas Burke, the father from that forest encounter, refused to discuss it for decades. Late in life, a researcher finally convinced him to talk. His hands shook as he described that afternoon. The way the thing moved, the smell of it, how his dogs, fearless hunting hounds, cowered like puppies. He died insisting every word was true. These men had nothing to gain from maintaining a lie. Cockrell's journalism career never recovered from the stigma. People who believed him thought he was brave. People who didn't thought he was crazy or a fraud. Either way, the story defined him in ways he never wanted. If it was fabrication, he could have recanted, claimed youthful foolishness or a misunderstanding. He never did. So what stalked the woods and waters around Grafton in those years? Unknown species? Mutant? Interdimensional visitor? Mystical construct? Collective hallucination born from a traumatized community's need to externalize its pain? We can only wait and see if remains are ever recovered. Bones pulled from beneath river waters or deep within cave systems. Physical proof that would answer decades of questions and speculation. Until then, we're left with testimony. Eyewitness accounts from people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by reporting what they saw. The Grafton Monster remains unexplained. And perhaps that's fitting. In an age where everything is documented, analyzed, categorized, and explained, maybe we need some mysteries to endure. Some questions without answers. Some darkness that refuses to yield to light. The mountains of West Virginia keep their secrets well. The forests are deep. The caves run deeper. And on quiet nights, when fog rolls off the Tygart River and settles into the hollows, when the old buildings of Grafton cast long shadows, it's not hard to imagine something pale and massive moving through the darkness. Something that shouldn't exist but does. Something headless and ancient and utterly indifferent to human understanding. The people of Grafton learn to live with uncertainty, with questions that have no answers, with the knowledge that their small town, forgotten by progress and prosperity, still matters in one strange way. They're home to something impossible. Something that turned their dying community into a legend. And maybe that's enough.